All right. Hello, everybody. This is the Kubernetes SIG architecture meeting for January 14th, 2021. Happy New Year, everybody. It's the first meeting of the year, and we have a pretty short agenda. So let's just get started. It looks like first up we have Daniel. With a discussion around formalizing supported architectures.
Thanks, John. So as John said, my name is Daniel Mangum. I'm a tech lead for SIG release. And this cycle, I'm going to be leading some of the work around formalizing supported platforms. So, operating system architecture tuplets there. For Kubernetes, we've traditionally had a number of different supported architectures for the different artifacts we release, but we've never really formalized that. And as different, folks have come around and wanted to add support for things like RISC-V or the M1 Max was something recently that came up. We don't really have a well-defined process for that. So we're going to work on defining that. But obviously, as SIG architecture, y'all would have a large say in that. So as we start in on this journey, we wanted to make sure that we're aligned with y'all in some of our goals. So I have a short presentation here that I'll give real quick. And this is also shared in the agenda doc if anyone wants to review it afterwards. It's not real complex or anything like that, but it should give a good overview. Looks like I need screen sharing permissions.
Okay, yeah, just 1 second. Okay.
All right, looks good. Okay, so like I said, we're going to talk about supported platform formalization, and we have 4 main goals in this effort. So first is to define the official artifacts that we're currently releasing and the platforms that we support them on. And I'll give you a matrix in just a minute of what we as SIG release consider the officially supported architectures and artifacts. Then we want to define the tiers of support, right? If we're going to put things in different tiers, we need to know what the parameters are for including something in a given tier. Then we want to look at the official artifacts that we are releasing right now and put them into those tiers. And finally, we want to define a formalized process for anyone who comes along and wants to add support for a new architecture for one of the artifacts we release, or we're obviously adding a new artifact at some point in the future. And we're going to be supporting different architectures for that. All right, so here's kind of a matrix of the different artifacts we release. So as you can see, this is primarily, most folks are interested in the binaries or container images. They're released for each of these artifacts, but there's also tarballs with the source code. There's different packages, etc. You can always look at the change log and the linked release artifacts there if you'd like to see all the different components. But you can see that, generally for a specific grouping of artifacts, so if we're talking about node artifacts or we're talking about server artifacts or client artifacts, you can see that they generally have the same supported operating system architecture tuplets here. And those obviously correspond directly to those supported by the Go compiler. And you can see that for instance, on the client side, we support far more architectures or at least double the number of architectures, which makes sense, right? Because more folks are going to be executing things on their machine with the client side than they're going to be needing to support on the server side. So this is kind of an overview of what we have right now. And I would specifically look at a lot of these platforms that you don't think that folks really use that much, or you don't think are well tested, because we'll get into that in a little bit. But you could consider these, at least from the SIG release perspective, the official artifacts that we release. In the past, there have been artifacts that we've dropped support for, so notably like Hypercube or Cloud Controller Manager, and you'll see those not mentioned here. There could be ones we drop in the future. Probably the only one on this list that's been considered would be Mounter down there at the bottom, which in my opinion doesn't really make sense to be in the release bundle, but that can be debated. Looking at the tiers of support as we've broadly defined them, and you can see a pull request open that has this in a more formal manner. But it's similar to what you'd see for a given compiler toolchain. And then we've kind of customized what it means to be in each tier to a Kubernetes perspective. So looking at fully supported, we're saying it's able to produce all applicable artifacts. So the binaries, images, packages, obviously for some of the artifacts, not all of them will be relevant. But all of those that are relevant, that we do produce those and release them in a Kubernetes release. We have full test coverage. So that is a little bit fluid right now in terms of what full test coverage would mean. But in a moment, I'll kind of talk about what our current metric is and why it's maybe not very good. And then the other component of testing would be that failing a test will block a release. So, we have the SIG release test grid dashboards, which we'll look at in a moment. And if a blocking job fails on there, then we're not going to run a release. The other thing would be fully documented. This is also a little bit fluid, and there isn't much difference between different architectures that you need to specifically have documentation for. But we do want to call that out as a component. Tier 2 would be that we're producing artifacts. So we produce all applicable artifacts as part of the Kubernetes release. So all of those, official artifacts that we looked at already, those would naturally fall into tier 2 because we are producing those artifacts. And we would like to have baseline test coverage. Once again, whatever that's defined as, basically saying this thing can actually be built and run. And the last thing would be possible to build. So this is a very kind of like nebulous tier. You could pretty much put anything that the Go compiler can compile into tier 3. But obviously there could be some cases, especially on the node side, where that isn't applicable. All right. So looking at the current
Daniel,
support.
Can I ask a question? Are you going to differentiate between platforms for which maybe we only produce client tools versus, like, I know you said in the tiers that's per artifact per platform, but I think conceptually people think about there's the server, there should be a lot more client potentially platforms than server platforms, or at least it's a broader set. Do we want to differentiate in some way in this scheme as far as tiers are concerned?
Yeah, I think so. So, at the beginning there, we saw that obviously the client does have a lot more supported architectures. I think as far as the tiers here, we're going to say each architecture per artifact. So that is not like doing any of the groupings in terms of node, client, and server. But at the end here, I have a list of open questions that's going to be basically, are we open to supporting a platform for the Cube API server that's not for the controller manager? That really wouldn't make much sense. So that would be something that we'd say, like, these are kind of like tightly coupled groups of artifacts where we want to add support for all of them at the same time. Looking at the current support levels that we have, by the definitions that I just gave for the different tiers, we would really only say that Linux AMD 64 is the fully tier 1 supported artifacts. That's because that's really the only thing that's blocking a release for us at this time. There is definitely testing done for other platforms, specifically for ARM and Windows platforms, but we don't block a release if those are failing, right? So if you look at the master blocking board, you're not going to see any releases for those architectures. And so one of the things that we'd like to do as part of this effort is be able to have a single pane of glass for kind of like test coverage for an architecture, right? So if a SIG adds a job for the thing that they own, the artifact that they own for a specific architecture, we'd like to surface that on a broader board for that architecture, so that it's clear the full test coverage we have for a given platform, which helps us categorize things into tiers. So the main thing that we want to have for this, right, is moving forward when someone comes and says, I want to add support for this platform for a given artifact, what do they need to do to make that happen? So a big part of this is establishing someone or a group of people who over the long term are going to support that platform. I look at this a lot with how we interact with the Go team, in that, we kind of have liaisons between Kubernetes and Go and have a strong relationship there that make sure, that we're going to be able to support that going into the future. And this is obviously going to have high overlap with that, right? Because we are directly, reliant on the architectures and operating systems that the Go compiler supports. So if it's a net new architecture, so in the case of like RISC-V, we'd like to have some relationship with folks that are working on that part of the Go compiler, or part of the RISC-V community that have a pulse on things that are happening there, right? So that things come up related to that architecture, that they're kind of the point person to make sure we have good communication there. If it's a new platform just for a specific artifact, so let's say, we already produce a artifact for a given platform, it could likely just be folks from the owning SIG, right? Because we probably already either have high confidence in being able to build artifacts for that platform, or we already have a relationship with folks from a community that are going to help us there. The next thing you need to be able to do is demonstrate the ability to build and run the artifact on a platform. So we don't want to be producing artifacts that are not able to be run. So this is a bit of a hazy step. In fact, all of these steps I think need much more like tangible guidelines. But as an overview, right, we'd like to see that there's something backing up the motivation to do so. The next thing you would do, which you could consider moving into tier 2, is actually start producing the binaries or images or other artifacts. And this typically doesn't require a lot of work. If you look back through some of the PRs that have added support for different platforms, you can see that it's frequently very little changes, but it can affect other parts of the release pipeline. So you would definitely want input from SIG architecture folks, as well as SIG release and release engineering. But the first step in terms of supporting something, right, is producing the artifacts so we can start testing them. The next thing you'd want to do is start running periodic jobs. So this could be, if it's for a specific artifact, this may be very apparent, and it may go through the SIG, who's the owner of that artifact. But you need to be testing something, right, to start to progress towards tier 1. And also tier 2 has a requirement of some baseline testing, essentially showing that it's able to perform the baseline functionalities that artifact is built for. The next thing you'd want to do is meet the bar of sufficient test coverage. So that would, right now I'd say what we do for Linux AMD 64 would be what we are implicitly saying is the bar for sufficient test coverage. Whether we have really good insight into what that actually means is another question that I think should be addressed through this process. But we do need to have a line that says, okay, this has all of the conformance tests running against it, or all the different API tests, et cetera, to be able to make sure that this is something that we feel confident putting out into the community and saying, hey, this will work in mission critical scenarios. And the last thing we'd want to do, which kind of makes something the definition of tier 1, would be to promote that to a release blocking job. So, a failure of that job is going to keep us from actually putting out artifacts to the community. And that would kind of be the final step. And then we would go on maintaining it just as we do for artifacts for Linux AMD 64 right now. Also at the bottom here are links to a few recent PRs where someone wanted to add support for a platform, and we, kind of didn't know what to tell them, or we didn't have a process for them, taking steps to make that happen. So even if they were someone who was really, reliable and someone we could count on to support the thing, there just wasn't good steps for getting that reviewed and getting that supported. All right. So as I mentioned numerous times throughout this, there are some open questions and things that we will define as we go through this process. But overall, the number one question, especially talking to SIG architecture today, is, does this effort feel worthwhile, right? Do you feel like this is something that's important? Obviously, adding new architectures and platforms is not something that happens, extremely regularly, but it happens with enough regularity that, it makes sense to have a process for doing it. Also just adds more reliability, right? When you have a process for changes that are happening and for changes to the things that we're releasing to the community. Is there a desire for more official artifacts to reach tier 1 support? So right now, as you saw in that matrix earlier, we have a number of different platforms that we support, but there hasn't been a strong push for things to become tier 1 or become release blocking from the most part. And hopefully, as Kubernetes continues to proliferate, other platforms, that there could be a larger push for this. But I could also see a lot of folks saying, well, we're getting the binaries released and they're working for our use cases. So, is there really a point in adding more test coverage here? Do I really want to put in the effort? Is our current level of testing for tier one artifacts sufficient? So that was kind of what I alluded to earlier. We have this bar of reaching tier one that's going to say you have sufficient test coverage. What does that really mean right now? I personally, as someone who's done a lot of CI signal work, don't feel like we have a great story of what sufficient testing means for all of Kubernetes. So I'd like to drive a more tangible definition for that, a more measurable definition, which is required for progressing things through these stages. And then the last one here, which I think John was kind of alluding to earlier, is it acceptable to support a platform for only one of a common group of artifacts? So this would be like, the server binaries or something like that. Do we really just want to support RISC-V builds for the API server and not for the controller manager? Likely no, I'd say. And I actually don't really think this will come up that much because tightly coupled release artifacts usually, adding support for one of them is about as easy as adding support for the other, and they're going to be tested together and that sort of thing. But it is something to think about, right, as we put things into these tiers and progress them through. So that's pretty much all I have for y'all today. Like I said, there are a lot of open questions here. But before we get, really far down this path, we definitely want to solicit input and advice from SIG architecture.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Daniel. This is awesome. Really, really good presentation. Thanks for putting it together. Can you leave the questions up, please?
Oh, sure.
So it's easier to talk about them. I definitely, this has been bugging a bunch of us for a while now, and we've did fits and starts, and we ended up checking in at least one document to guide the work. So yes, thanks for doing this, and hopefully this will help a bunch more people. So is there a desire for more official artifacts? So a couple of ways to answer this question. One is, like, for example, we are there are other projects that are able to say that they support other platforms like ARM 32, ARM 64, those kinds of platforms, and we don't do that, even though they are using our code and they are essentially doing the testing for us. So the recent bug that you saw about the Golang started with K3s, and then it came to Kate's issue, and then we went back to Golang, and so I think that we could have caught that earlier if we had testing for ARM 32 better. So I think we should own this a little bit. And not end up having people going and testing in K3s and then coming back to us saying, oh, Kate's is broken, right? That's what they end up saying. So I would like to see both the edge device scenarios as well as the server ARM64 scenarios to move forward. So I think there'll be enough people interested in those two areas to consider that. Then, for example, PowerPC folks have been really good at working with us, especially taking care of all the images and stuff like that. So, they don't really show up as much because they are not end users who use PowerPC. It's more like a one single vendor that is taking care of one architecture. So you don't see too much traffic from an end user perspective, but it's been solid and it's been green for a while. So I think they would like to. I know that they would like to apply for a specific tier when it comes to and check the boxes that we tell them to check, right? Is the current level of testing for tier one's artifact sufficient? Sometimes I feel even the AMD64 is not ever sufficient, right? So, but if we have to draw a line, then we would say the pre-summit job that we have, the pre-summit CI job that runs a whole bunch of tests, that one, then the conformance test and the node conformance test would be like three checkboxes there that we would need to say, yeah, you need to have all three of these. They don't, each architecture doesn't have to be pre-submit, they could be post-submit, but the equivalent jobs, right? Like periodic jobs that do exactly the same thing that the pre-submit does. Or it can be launched on demand. Either way, that would be good. So I think the fourth one, I think we might have three ways of looking, three buckets, so to say. One is a client, like uh, Darwin ARM64. The other one would be a node. So this could be like a Windows node, for example, right? There's some bits of our stuff runs on Windows. So that would be a second bucket. And the third bucket would be a full server. So I think we would say there are three buckets, and the people who are looking at different architectures would say, oh, I want to target one of these buckets or all three of these buckets. They could pick and choose, right? And yeah, I would say that we don't want to certify just one component. If we would say you have to conform this whole bucket. The why I'm saying that is like, then we could have three different variations of tests, right? We have the node conformance test for the node, so that will take care of that bucket. We have some conformance tests or something like that for the server bucket, and we would definitely have a client bucket. I don't think we have a standalone test suite for the client side stuff, but we could. There is enough material that we can carve out into a client side test, I think. So that would be my quick feedback on these questions.
Awesome, thank you.
Hey, Dims, maybe I'll just chime in and say, so we can have maybe some consensus. So like, definitely a +1 on this effort being worthwhile. I guess from my perspective, I agree with Dims completely that it's likely that other artifacts will elevate from tier 2 to tier 1, and I could see ARM being the first one to do that. I like the way this is broken down, that allows for tier 2 and tier 3 to continue compiling, particularly on architectures that have been good actors thus far, like 390 and Power. So I like Dim's representation of that. Testing for tier 1, I mean, I think like everything, we always want testing to be better everywhere. So I don't think it's specific to this problem. And then I liked the breakdown, I think, Dims, that you try to identify, which is basically grouping of components by where they are in our client server architecture. So breaking out client components like kubectl separately from, say, what typically runs on a control plane versus what's needed to get a worker. And so I think if we have those three buckets, then the Windows example is the one that is very clear as being only, in many cases, needing a worker bucket to be satisfied, and probably a client bucket, but not control plane. So basically, I'm very pleased by the way this is presented in the outcome. So this all looks great to me.
Yeah, I'll third that. Yeah, I think definitely this is worthwhile. Yes, we don't onboard platforms, but even the existing platforms we have, being able to articulate that to customers in the community is I think really, really important. The different levels of support. So yeah, I'm thumbs up on all of that. I would have a question. What is the downside from a qualification, like practically? There may be communication downsides, but like if we didn't bother with the buckets and we simply said, this artifact is at this level, at this tier for this platform, are there testing implications? Like I want to make sure that our test boards and our signal is as clear, and but have you thought through the implications of that, I guess?
Yeah, I think Dim's kind of like gave a good perspective on that at the beginning, that right now, like the three critical like kind of like groups of testing that we do already exercise the different components for the different groups. So it would obviously be a downside in that we'd have to figure out how to test an artifact for a specific platform without some of its like counterparts in that specific group. If we look back at the matrix, you can see we've already implicitly done exactly what's been articulated here. As you can see, you know, kube proxy, kube admin, kubelet, you know, all have the same. kubectl has the same, and then server components have the same. So in practice, I don't see anyone ever really making an effort to do that. And I think, you know, formalizing it as saying you do have to support an entire group if you're going to add a platform, just kind of like reiterates that. So I think that is a good path forward.
I guess when we have our language, we're not including Windows as a defined platform per se. We don't have a word for that here, maybe, but that's the one that stands out to me as the Delta group here, right? The last two columns on the right.
When you say it's a delta and that it crosses two different groups here, I'd say, right?
It's node and client, but not
right.
Not control plane, yeah.
Right, and then Darwin and Linux 386, of course, would be client and not node and server. So yeah, right. Like right now, I'd say that we do honor the grouping and how we do things.
The one other thing that is not captured here, Daniel, would be like what is the entry criteria for a tier 3, right? Like the problem with risk, for example, was either you needed a custom build of a Golang compiler, or there are some things were not available, and people could build it behind the scenes with patches, but it. So I would say that the bar for the tier 3 would be anybody should be able to build the components, and we should be able to document what versions of things are needed to be able to build the artifacts, right? So we would have some entry. So going from tier to tier, we'll need some guidance, as well as just getting into the whole bucket is going to be another thing. Then an additional twist that we haven't captured here, we should, is to be able to go to tier 1 from tier 2. There is a whole bunch of things that we need to do to make sure that all the images that we need for conformance testing are enabled for that architecture. And they are kind of continuing to work, right? Like we found out yesterday, this bunch of images, conformance image wasn't working, right? So, so we would need to make sure that that people understand that it is not just the components that you can build, but also the additional support things that would be needed. We need to make sure that we tell them beforehand that that's a big bar.
Absolutely, that's a great point. All right, well, I appreciate you all taking the time to hear the presentation today. Obviously, as we go through the different steps for this, I'll continue to communicate back with folks here, and I'm sure that there will be opportunities for us to ask for your input on some of these things, especially on the more granular requirements. But thank you all for taking the time today.
Daniel, one request to SIG releases, can we add some verification steps so we don't break the manifests next time when we make a release? So let's do that for 121, please.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Daniel. That's great stuff. Next item on the agenda, last item, production readiness review update. So that's a sub-project here in SIG architecture. And for those of you, there's been a couple of leads meetings, so I'm repeating myself over and over. Some of you will have heard this already, but so as folks here know, we've been working on production readiness for a few releases. And in December, we sent out an email and for lazy consensus on merging enforcement of production readiness review approval within KEPs that are targeted to a release and implementable state. And we got the feedback that, hey, it was December and nobody, there are a lot of people who maybe didn't see that lazy consensus. So we disabled the enforcement of that policy. And we've had a number of discussions over the last couple days around this policy. And the plan right now is for me to write a PR that re-enables it, but adds some additional context, explanation, some information about how new people can be added to the ladder, a little more detail on the process, and some explanation around why we don't expect any sort of bottleneck, given that we've done a piloting of this for the last couple of releases. So that's on me. I will get that out. I was supposed to get it out by today, but I didn't. I will get it out tomorrow at the latest. And then the idea is that PR, I would ask that those folks who are interested, please take a look at that early next week. It will be on a 3-day lazy consensus. So that will merge back in Wednesday unless the consensus is otherwise. So that would be enabling enforcement of that process for KEPs going into enhancements freeze for 121. Any questions on that? Okay, awesome. All right, well, that's the end of our agenda. So I guess let's get back a little bit of time, and everybody have a great weekend coming up. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.